Welcome everybody. I'm nervous. How are you guys doing? Anybody out there nervous? So it's what I do. But let's start by introducing ourselves a little bit. So my name is Maria Ochoa. I am a licensed clinical social worker and a PsyD student. I triage the calls for KS&A. So when you call that 1-800 number or you send an email, you talk to me. Sometimes it takes a little bit for me to get back to you, but I do get back to you. If you don't hear from me, my personal information is on here. Sometimes things go to spam. Blow me up. It's not going to bother me at all. Call me, email me, text me if you want to. It's okay. So out of curiosity, what age groups do we have here? Who has young children? Infants? Adult children? Alrighty. So I know where to really focus this particular presentation, so we'll breeze through some things and not through others because it's a little long. Here are some objectives we're really going to work on. Crisis is in the title. Why? Because when people call me, it's not because they're doing great, right? They're in crisis. Something's happened. And ways that we need to really approach crisis is not really handling it in the muck of things. We really want to be focused on prevention. We want to have the ability to navigate crisis should we be in it. And then more important than that, once we're out of crisis, we want to have some sort of homeostasis where we can maintain that and not return to crisis. All too often, you tend to end up back in the same situations over and over again. We really want to prevent that because that increases trauma. All of you guys want your children to have a low stress life, and when you're constantly entering the same situation, it's going to perpetuate a sense of stress and really reduce the basic needs that we need in order for someone to function. This is what I'm really hoping to help you guys achieve by the end of this presentation. Ultimately, I would like you guys to leave here thinking of ways that you can begin the process of developing a comprehensive preparedness plan. What does that mean? Just like planning for a tornado, right? There may never be a tornado in Florida, but they have a preparedness plan for it. There may never be an earthquake in Colorado, but they have a preparedness plan for it. That's really what I want you guys to be able to do. I want you to look at 1-year plans, 5-year plans, 10-year plans, 20-year plans, and really begin there, okay? So moving on, we're going to define crisis. Basically, we look at one's perception or experience of an event or situation as intolerable difficulty. This difficulty is going to exceed your resources and coping mechanisms. Yes?
I think there's a disconnect.
Sure.
Between what our schedules say and what you're talking about.
Exactly, yes.
What are you guys looking for?
Government benefits.
Government benefits? That's what I'm talking about. But guess who ends up in crisis? People that haven't planned for their government benefits. So we want to really focus on resources and coping mechanisms. Thank you in the back. What are your resources? Government services. Those resources are what's going to help to keep you out of crisis and also help you cope once you're in. This is Maslow's hierarchy of basic needs, psychology jargon. But why is this important? This is important because without the basic needs, your bottom tier, your psychological needs, you're not going to have a person that's highly functioning. You're going to end up in crisis a lot because the bottom of the pyramid is going to be somewhat disconnected. Basic needs include government services, SSI, medical, food cards, housing, education, jobs. All those are really focusing there. As you have a disconnect there, you end up with problems on the top. Once we get problems on the top, we're really in a big disconnect. That's when you end up with your mental health holds. Okay, so we really want to look at how we're going to plan for that and what services do we need to keep out of that or to navigate that once we're in it. Causes of crisis, this shouldn't be a surprise. Different things that happen over the course of your life that would shake up the sense of homeostasis is going to cause these types of crisis. Lack or loss of basic needs. If you lose your services, if you don't have your services, that's going to keep you in crisis. Depression, anxiety. Again, if you don't have your medical services already in place, that's what's going to fall apart. Types of crisis. This is what I hear when people call. Okay, and these are the resources that I try to provide people with. There's a medical emergency. There's an academic emergency. Timmy did something in school, he's now expelled. Or for your adult children, Jimmy has a new girlfriend. She has a substance abuse habit. What do I do? All these things are what I hear very frequently. Running away is not just limited to your teenagers. We have adults that disappear. You guys don't know where they go. What resources do you need to have in place to make sure that your person is safe? Incarceration with the older population, What do you need to do service-wise to make sure that you're not looking at a long-term jail sentence? What do you need to do to ensure that your person is looked at from a subjective standpoint that takes into account their current diagnosis? Again, we're going to focus on crisis, how to prevent it, and how to plan for it, keep you out of it with the right resources. Step one, this is your step one to finding resources. KS&A, you guys are here. You found us, you're resilient. Congratulations, you're all going to do great in this. So what does KS&A provide? We have professional networks. Everybody that you meet here is someone that you're going to need to facilitate your government services. The medical professionals, the education professionals, OT, PT, the people outside doing the study. Because guess what? You are not going to get any services unless you have data to support your diagnosis. All the time, people that are calling are telling me, well, you know, so-and-so applied for disability or Medicaid or some sort of assistance program, and they say chromosome variants are not considered something that would warrant disability. All the time. So what are you going to do? You need to have all your ducks in a row, have professionals to back you, have data to back you, make a binder of everything you've gotten here and every professional you've talked to here, and have that as a resource to support you in gaining services, because a diagnosis alone is not going to do that, okay? Also, are things well documented and are they supported? You can't do that without data. Unfortunately, this particular population does not have a significant amount of data that is familiar in a lot of the government service agencies. So you have to bring your own. So this isn't like telling somebody, oh, this is autism, and they're like, oh, we know what that is and what that does. They're not going to know what this is. They're not going to know what it does. They're probably going to have a very skewed or a misperception of what, in fact, the diagnosis facilitates or causes. And again, that kind of got cut off on my sticky note. Your documents have to be concise, clear, concise. Guess what? People at disability services, judges, police officers, social workers, mental health professionals, medical professionals don't like to read a 40-page article. So if you bring in a 40-page article explaining what a chromosome variant diagnosis is, probably not going to read it. If you have the article with citations and bullet points that you've pulled out of it, they'll probably read a one-page synopsis. That's how you want to go about getting your services, okay? All too often, parents will have their binder of stuff and just hand it to someone. Well, it's over 100 pages. Nobody's going to sit and read that. And so what they do is they glance over the first page and say, okay, chromosome variant, this is more of a reproductive issue. Doesn't sound like that needs disability. Did they read anything? No. Are you going to get services? No. So that's what you really want to avoid. We want to look at expanding your network. This is where we're getting into the government services. The Department of Developmental Delay. This particular agency has somewhat of a daunting name. And also the requirements for entry are somewhat pejorative to a lot of persons, and a lot of parents don't tend to apply for that because they look at that and say, well, my child's not mentally retarded. My child does not have an IQ of less than 70. That doesn't mean don't apply for the service. And the reasoning why is because this service is the single entry point, the only entry point into all government services. Without a liaison with this agency, I can almost guarantee you're going to have a very rocky road as far as obtaining services. If you link with this agency, the way it's going to work is they're going to give your individual an IQ test. If your individual is on Adderall, Ritalin, don't test on Adderall or Ritalin. Okay? You want to have a very clear expression of what you see from your kiddo on their worst day. Because when they're at work and they're in a crisis situation and they've got 1,000 people yelling at them because they're working a register somewhere and it's Christmas Eve and they blow up, you need to have this type of service. You need to have an expression of this is how my individual functions. This is not the SATs, okay? You don't have fish, you don't get a good night's rest, and you aren't just ready to go. No, you want, well, how do they function with no sleep? How do they function under anxiety? How do they function without their meds? If they drink a ton of coffee all the time and get wired, or monsters, I hear about those monsters all the time. If they drink those, have at it before you test, because that is what you see on their worst day. And that is what you really need to express to the Department of Developmental Delay. If you are lucky and they score under 70, your money. You're doing fabulous. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen very often. We tend to see just above in the 90s, in the 80s, or 74. How irritating is that? But there are ways around it. Keep trying, and again, make sure that when you had them test, they were at their baseline. In addition, I also tell people, if you have the ability, seek out a private IQ test. Okay? While those can be kind of expensive, there's lots of psychology schools in most areas. They usually have students there that are testing, and it's very low cost. So that's an option to go get a private test that you can bring with you to, again, collaborate with the data that the Department of Developmental Delay is going to get. Yes?
So if you know their IQ is going to be above 70, are you a non-starter?
No. I'm going to talk to you about how to navigate that too. So this is your single entry point. Again, if you can get it, great. If you don't, because you're in a different circumstance, we're going to talk about other ways to navigate that. Just a brief caveat, to find your local agency of Department of Developmental Delay, simply go to your Department of Human Services website, look up developmental disabilities, and then click on that. They're going to be categorized by region in your particular state, and that is where you're going to go, okay? So these agencies are not necessarily government. They're contracts of the government. They're nonprofit organizations. Again, we talked about how that's a single entry point. They're responsible for intake, eligibility determination, all the services that your individual is going to be eligible for, and also they're responsible for playing a role in managing things. So as the needs of your individual changes, so will the resources that they're able to provide for you. These are really comprehensive resources that they can provide. So through the Department of Developmental Delay, not just children, but anybody that qualifies may receive occupational, physical, speech, and behavioral therapy at no cost. Adults can also receive community-based services. What that means is an individual will come to their home, which will be provided for them through Department of Developmental Delay. If you're part of this, you bump up on the wait list for housing, for Section 8 housing. You bump up on the wait list, you get an apartment. But it's not just that. You also have somebody that comes by to check on you regularly, a case manager. Make sure things are clean. Make sure your food's not expired. Make sure that you're functioning in a way that would be necessary in order to maintain a basic level of human functioning, yes.
These are federal benefits, not state, because our state is basically dismantling everything that it's had.
What state is that?
North Carolina.
Okay. If it's federal and you can get it, go for it. But it's...
Are you talking about federal?
The Department of Developmental Delay is region-based, but their money comes from federal.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, no worries. So again, this is going to really facilitate resources and support. Also host homes, residential care, everything, case management, all that's going to be responsible through here. You're also going to have the ability to have advocates should a crisis occur. They're going to provide that for you. Jobs, they're going to provide that for you. Funding, they're going to provide that for you. This is awesome if you can get it. So what happens with different types of crisis, okay? Definitely I get a lot of calls where alcohol and drugs are involved, siblings, violence, different stuff. You really want to look at what the immediate need is. Where's your person at? And I know a lot of you are sitting here going, yeah, again, we want to talk about government resources. But if these things happen, a lot of the resources that you're going to need to account for this type of stuff. This is the calls that I get. And because they didn't have Department of Developmental Delay, because they hadn't already made a case with Department of Human Services or Adult Protective Services, these are the issues that arise, and there's no backing to remove yourself from them or your individual. So we talk about power struggling, having a de-escalation plan. For those of you who have children that are older, they have to take part in this. A lot of the times I hear about my kiddo doesn't, or my adult child does not want to apply for these services. They don't feel that there's a problem. They feel that this will reflect poorly on them amongst their peers. So what I explain to people is you really want to have a way to approach talking to your individual. One of those are choice statements. You can go to your interview with Department of Human Services, or you can go to your interview with the Department of Developmental Disability. All right, it's a choice. There's autonomy there, but you definitely want to close in the parameters, and I know that's very difficult with adults, or teenagers even, but you still want to make sure that this happens, because when you're looking at somebody that's in their 20s or 30s, you're going to have a big crisis on your hands, okay? Also, I tell people when you go to apply for these services or you have resources, support, advocacy, You want to have this all written down. Because when you're going to need these services, you're not going to remember Mary, the case manager that you spoke to once over the phone, who actually knew about the chromosome variant population. You're going to want to have those resources in place. Again, we talked about things not to do in order to get these things to happen, to get resources in place and to work with your individual. I know we don't have a lot of kids here. How many kids do we have that are still in school, public school? Okay, do they have IEPs? Do IEPs include behavior? For all of you? Okay. Even though your kiddo may not have behavioral issues, you still need to talk to the other parents. You need to go on the forums and pick out all the different things that parents are talking about have happened. Because with zero tolerance in schools, your kiddo will be expelled with just an academic IEP. Okay? If little Tim, or not little Timmy, but 16-year-old Timmy maybe is too affectionate with a freshman, he's going to be expelled. He's going to have criminal charges. Those are the calls I get. Those are problems. So as far as a government resource, IEPs, we have them. You have the ability to include behaviors in them. Again, you want to look at your child's worst. On the worst possible day, what catastrophic thing can happen? Can he pack a butter knife to put in his, to use for his lunch and then get expelled because he has a weapon? Yes, that's a behavior that needs to be in there.
There's no IEPs in college. What can we do there?
College, you want to link with your, what is it called? Student Services. Student Services has a department for, gosh, I'm drawing a blank on the name. Students with disabilities. All campuses have them. They all have a social worker that works through them. This is when you're going to want those documentation. Social workers are very kind and not love to read, but they love to learn new things. If you bring your points that explains the diagnosis, explains behaviors, explains learning criteria, needs, and you have those documented and backed up, they will make sure all of those services are in place. That includes a note taker, audio recordings of classes if they need it, tutors, extended testing time, where they test. If the particular social worker needs to be in the testing room behind them and there needs to be nobody else in that room, it'll happen. Now there's a small caveat. Private universities don't have to do it, they will. And definitely if you have your resources in place and you know services for advocacy like equal opportunity, the Americans with Disabilities Act, all those things, and you bring those into play, you will get your services. Okay? Yes?
I just wanted to say that my son just started college this summer, and he is getting an amazing array of services, both through the Office of Disabilities and through another program called CAP. He gets up to 8 hours of free tutoring per class per week.
Now, that being said,
Yes.
well, it depends, but you have to find that social worker. Every university is going to have a center for students with disabilities. They all will. Okay, now the level of accommodations according to universities, I don't know if I have this on here, is reasonable accommodations. Reasonable meaning you get an extra 10 minutes. But if you really push and you have your documentation that shows, look, in high school he had time and a half, and this is where his grades changed. And you have that data and that documentation, you have a leg to stand on. If you're in an uphill battle with somebody who's not willing to give you services, you have to have that data.
I think our state situation is probably unique because everything has literally been gutted. I used to work as an advocate in the criminal system.
I'm willing to do some research for you and take a look at it, and
We
we'll.
can talk about it after this.
Sounds like a good plan.
I think it's only relevant to me.
One more thing that I really want to bring up with the college kiddos. If in college, if they do not ask each professor for their accommodations every quarter, even if they're linked with the Department of Students or with the Students with Disability Services, they're not going to get their accommodations. Okay, and if they go up to their professor on the day of testing and say, hey, I need to take my test somewhere else, they're not going to get their accommodations, and they don't have to. Okay, so at the beginning of the quarter, if you need to grab every one of your kiddos' syllabi and email their professors, you do that, and email, because you want a paper trail. Okay, don't just go up to them and say, hey, I need this. It's happened before. Kids have told their professors, The professors forget. Another thing that when there's testing at the Center for Students with Disabilities, they have the ability to ask questions. Some professors will tell you, well, you can't ask questions if you test there. Yes, you can. A lot of the services, if you suggest it, you have to be in the know, and you have to suggest, you have to facilitate, you have to have your own problem solving in place. They don't have the time and they don't have the resources to do it for you. So what you want to suggest is, can my student call from the case manager, social worker's office, whatever, if they have a question? And 9 out of 10 times the answer should be yes. And the professor will sit there during the test in whatever building they're at with the other kiddos, or on a different time if that works better for them, to pick up the phone and answer questions. They are able to have that. You just have to finagle it. So this goes over IEPs, talks about IEPs advocates. They're not always available, but they're a great resource to have. This peakparenting.org is a great resource. Make sure your IEP is airtight. Even if your kiddo's 18 and about to graduate, get an IEP with cognitive and behavioral issues, because you're going to need it when they go to college, trade school, community college, whatever. Okay? This is all like domestic violence. If there was never a case at the very beginning, you cannot say that 40 years down the line. Nobody's going to believe that it's valid. So you want to make sure that this has constantly been documented. If there was a day you took a test and didn't get accommodations, document it. Have a copy of the test. Have him retake the test. Have both those copies. That is what you need, okay? Peer influence. This is as significant in college, high school, elementary school as it is everywhere else. Drugs, alcohol, all that stuff is available, or is not available, well, it is available, but it's a big problem. So we really want to make sure that you are very informed, especially in college, okay? A lot of parents that I've talked to are not aware that some of those energy drinks have alcohol in them. They do. They have a very high alcohol content. I got a call from a mother who said, well, my kiddo drinks about 7 of those a day. And I just found out there's alcohol in them.
Which ones have alcohol?
The Trace Locos something. There's several in that same thing that are really high stimulant value, but then also very high sedative value, so you tend to get an almost psychotic effect, okay? So you want to be very careful. You want to be aware of what your kid is doing. Look at it. What are they doing in college? If the other kids in college are drinking 7 Red Bulls a day and not eating, that is not going to work for your individual, and you need to be in tune to that. Emergency medical needs. This is another government resource we're going to touch on. So if your individual has not qualified for services through Department of Developmental Delay, and they have medical needs, and they end up in the hospital for any reason, doesn't matter if it's a ruptured appendix, get with a social worker. Whatever social worker is on your floor, make your best friend. Bring her some donuts and some coffee, because you're going to need her. Because when they're in the hospital, they have the ability to have a lot of things expedited. That means getting Medicaid. If they're on the cusp of being off your insurance, and you want to make sure that they're going to have their medical needs met, if they're in the hospital, do that. Here we have several state hospitals, state-run hospitals, Denver Health, actually this hospital right here, where they will help your child to qualify for any types of services. Sometimes they'll do that even if you're not a patient, but if you call and make an appointment with the Medicaid coordinator or a social worker, they'll help you to fill out those applications. Then the hospital will submit them. Well, when the hospital submits them, they can be expedited if there's an emergency. If your kiddo's in the emergency room and doesn't have insurance, those can be really pushed through. Same thing with disability applications. They can also do those for you too. So give it a shot. Even if you've applied for it before, have a social worker do it, because guess what? They know how to fill out the forms. And they'll help you to navigate that. So definitely use that for any reason. Get in touch with them when you get home and see what you can do to have them help you. Also, they're going to help with food services, lodging. Here's the deal with being in the hospital, is they look at, are you in crisis now? So just because you're homeless, then it doesn't mean that you're currently homeless because you're in a hospital. So you want to make sure that you're very clear. If your kiddo is 21 and wants to move out of your house, or 18 and wants to move out of your house, on his applications, he is homeless. If he doesn't pay you rent, he is homeless. If you can kick him out at any point in time, he is homeless. okay? Make sure you really stress those in any of these situations. You do want to have a very clear presentation of what is there. If something were to happen to you tomorrow, is your individual going to be able to stay in your house? No, he's homeless, okay? So that's what's going to get him Medicaid or her Medicaid services, because they are income-based, okay? They are not going to affect your taxes. They are not going to affect your work or anything like that. So please do try to get Medicaid, even if they're not registered with the Department of Disability.
I have a question about
Yes.
this really quick. So the new federal law is that you can choose to carry your adult child until they're 26. But
I believe that's if they're a full-time student. No. No? Oh, even better. But still, get Medicaid, because it'll be a supplement to your insurance.
that was my question, is even if you can do that, can you still try to get Medicaid?
It'll be a supplement, yeah.
Yeah.
So different resources. Let's look at Medicaid. So what does Medicaid do? You all know it's a healthcare-based program. It provides financial assistance for medical expenses based upon medical criteria, age, and financial need. Where the financial need comes into play, again, is housing and what is your child. If they have a car and it's in your name, that is not part of their financial assets, okay? So if your kiddo wants to put that down because they're very proud of their car, really encourage them not to. Because I believe, and don't quote me on this, but I believe the cap for assets is somewhere around $1,000. Okay, so you want to make sure that their assets are very low. If they have a trust, or you're going to give them a trust or a grant or stocks, apply for this first. Okay, so make sure that you take care of that. Again, income-based, limited assets, and one of the following. Disabled is what's going to really qualify, okay? So, what resources are available? Supports, how do we problem solve? How do we reduce conflict in physical and psychological settings? So we want to make sure SSI is something that's available. A lot of the time parents will talk to me about SSDI, and they'll call the hotline and request SSDI, and then they give me a call and they say, I didn't qualify. I'm not going to qualify. That's because SSDI is a whole nother ballgame. I know it's got the D in it, but it is not for disability. You want SSI. Okay? They're not going to tell you that over the phone after you've filled out the hundreds and hundreds of pages of applications that you should have applied for SSI instead of SSDI. So make sure you know what you're applying for. So what is the eligibility for that? They must have a medically determinable physical or mental impairment that is expected to result in death or will last for at least 12 consecutive months. A lot of the physiological issues that happen amongst the population are really not enough to qualify for SSI. There's two mental health diagnoses that do qualify for SSI. One is bipolar disorder, the other schizophrenia. Okay? I encourage all parents to have your child see a psychologist. Okay? And that has its pros and its cons. A lot of the time diagnoses aren't necessarily linear with the population. It's not, what's the word I'm looking for? There's no correlation, right, between mental health and the chromosome variants. However, you get a psychologist that's willy-nilly with diagnoses, you're going to get a bipolar diagnosis 9 out of 10 times. I hear that all the time with the population. That's not a bad thing, okay? Because it's going to get you qualified for services if you could not go the Department of Developmental Delay route. If your child is diagnosed, or your adult is diagnosed with bipolar or schizophrenia or a personality disorder, don't fret too much about it. Unless you're planning to run for president or go into the military, it's not that big of a deal, okay? And they are not required to be on medication for that either, okay? But what it is going to do is get them services. And even if they are receiving services, they're not required to be on medication, okay?
I'm sorry, what did you say qualified them, bipolar and what else?
Bipolar and schizophrenia. Those are the only two mental health diagnoses. Schizophrenia. Yes.
What if your child is over 18?
Still going to qualify with schizophrenia or bipolar for SSI.
If they don't have schizophrenia, like,
Have them see a psychologist. Do they have any behavioral issues? None at all? Nothing no bad days where they've flown off the handle?
before testosterone, but not after testosterone.
Have a psychological eval and give the mental health professional what they were like before the testosterone. Okay?
What about autism?
That may fall under physical, I think. It doesn't...
I believe autism no longer I'm talking about my state now,
Mm-hmm.
but I have a friend whose son is Asperger's, and it is no longer on the DSM, and it no longer qualifies you for SSI.
But sometimes the umbrella PDD NOS does, depending on your state.
I mean, it's very, that's why I said, it is a complicated system, and you really need help for people to help you go through this, and somebody who really knows.
If they've been on the autism spectrum or the Asperger spectrum, you want to really have those behaviors documented in some way and take that to a psychologist. Sometimes they will get a second diagnosis of bipolar along with that, and then, I mean, right, so you're going to have your axis 1, your axis 2, and on your axis 3 you're going to have the autism and or Asperger's, and then on your axis 1 you really want that bipolar. Okay? So it's an option, but definitely try to explore it. The whole reason of being here is to show you guys different paths. There's no one path that has worked. If there was, I wouldn't have a job. I'd be okay with that, but I wouldn't have a job. So we definitely need to explore different avenues to approach this. Here and then in the back.
Just briefly, the document that helped me the most, because my son does get SSI, I have kept, especially if you have young kids, I've kept a lifetime timeline of every hospitalization, every medication, every doctor visit, every school change, every IEP, everything. And they looked at that and were like, okay.
Exactly. Because if they're not acting that way now, unless you have that documentation with dates and with some sort of substantiated validation, it's gonna be like it never happened. So yeah, if they were hospitalized at any point in time, have it. If they had police contact at any point in time, have it documented. I mean, unfortunately, in the current parental stage you're at, this isn't something you just kind of forget. It was a bad day, it happened. You need it to apply for services.
I can simply apologize.
Sure.
Covered this. My son's 28, he's been fully evaluated by Nicole and crew. He doesn't qualify as disabled, but he's a plan to understand he's got issues. Is he eligible for any of this?
Has he seen a psychologist? Does he have any diagnoses at all?
They called him autistic in the school. So yeah, we've got some track records there.
I would say see a private psychologist, take all the issues that have come up and bring those with you as part of your history and see if you can get a different diagnosis. Because you may not qualify on the physiological route, most of these individuals don't, despite the high physical needs. But possibly the mental health route may get your foot in the door. Again, I understand that you may not want your child to have a mental health diagnosis. That's okay. But if that's the only thing that's going to get him services, what's the lesser of two evils? Right? Back here.
No, my son has an IEP for emotional disturbance. Now, will that, and he's been hospitalized for, mental, but they diagnosed him as ADHD instead of bipolar. So, but will that IEP for the emotional disturbance help? Or is that...
That's actually a good question. You need specific examples in your IEP. And that's where you really need to have your documentation in place and where you need to be thinking proactively. So I would encourage you to think about when he's had emotional issues, what specifically were they? Does he throw things? Does he slam things? Does he make threats? Does he walk out? What are those, and have those covered in the IEP? Because if he gets up and walks out of class because he's frustrated, is that going to get him in trouble? It's a subjective thing. Emotional needs is very subjective, so you want clear-cut examples in your IEP. There was a question somewhere back there.
Speaking of the incidents that happen in school and home, you say to document everything. Probably 3 times a week we go through a mental breakdown at home. Would you consider those as examples? He throws things, he hits things, he punches.
We are in the wonderful world of technology. I would say get your phone and video record.
See, I started doing some of that, including falling asleep at the dinner table.
Video record, video record, video record, have those on DVD after DVD and DVD. When you go see your psychologist, psychiatrist, medical doctor, bring those with you. When you go to any of these government services, bring those with you. That is a powerful resource because again, most of the time the professionals don't see your kiddo at their worst. You need to have the ability to show them that.
We get SSI as the umbrella, but we don't get benefits. So they've approved us, but we don't get anything. I have to get out of pocket.
Let's talk after, because that's something new that I haven't heard of, but let me figure out how we can approach that. Alrighty, what's that say? Document, document, document. Do everything you can to have this validated and keep it organized, okay? Make sure that you have a DVD for tantrums, a DVD for falling asleep, a DVD for of him studying. Does he sit down, study, get up, walk around, do this, look around? You want that because that's powerful. You can't explain that to someone really, and even if you do, they may or may not actually believe what you're saying until they see it for themselves. Okay, and it's just because as a parent, you definitely are biased. So you want to have that validated. Everything that you can think of, okay? Remember, you will be asked for documentation and specific examples. So again, like with the IEP, if it's emotional needs and he gets really mad and says, God, I wish I could kill you. Is that an emotional need or is that a threat? I think that's a threat. Falls under zero tolerance, falls under a law enforcement report. Okay? If that happens in college, it's definitely a law enforcement report. So you want an IEP from when he was 16, 17 that has that in there. Okay? Also, documentation is going to help you to remember events. We forget things. We'd rather not remember the worst times. So definitely make sure that you have those available. You want dates so that you can show how often things happen. And then also, it'll help to keep you organized. Because when you're really going to need these documentations, you're going to feel frazzled, you're going to feel anxious, and it's going to be really difficult to recall these. Okay? So you definitely want those available.
Would keeping a journal of their emotional meltdowns and destructive episodes, is that something that would be beneficial or not?
It will be, because it's going to show directly what's happening. But I think sometimes with journals you want to perhaps be, well, I mean, I think it can be helpful, but I'd say know what's in there before you just hand it off to someone, just to kind of...
I don't mean real specific. I mean in that way. I just mean Tarkin's room today.
Okay, yes, that's great. And take a picture. Yeah, picture's worth 1,000 words. And because we can do that now and it's so easy to do it. Department of Human Services, they're probably the least helpful on the spectrum. But unfortunately, 9 out of 10 times individuals or parents are going to end up having some sort of contact with DHS. And most of the times it's not positive. No parent wants a social worker calling them from DHS, right? Saying, ooh, yeah, we got to do home visits because Timmy touched somebody inappropriately, even though it was a hug or it was a push, and he pushed a girl and he pushed her in the wrong place. You're going to have contact with DHS, even if they're in college. Okay? You definitely want to be cognizant of what is being said, and you don't want to get defensive. This is when you want to have your documentation in place too, because if boundaries was an issue in high school, you're going to want to have that available to you so that you can show that this was not intended to be malicious. A lot of the times too, DHS gets involved because individuals tend to date younger populations. Okay? That is also why you need documentation in place. When things end up getting to the point that there's police contact, there's running away because the problem's escalated so much, behavioral issues are coming home because DHS is wondering where this is all stemming from, and they don't really know what Klinefelter's trisomy X, XXYY, XXXYY are. You want to make sure that you have the ability to explain why these behaviors happen, that there's not something catastrophic going on at home. And again, if you don't have documentation to substantiate that, and you're just saying, hey, I'm telling you that nothing bad has happened at home, I don't know if that's going to really be your best defense. So definitely make sure that you have the ability to work with them. Okay, you don't want to be combative, but you want to work with them and make sure that this will also be something that can potentially help you in the long run. Because guess what? You've got another site of documentation for something that happened. Look at the positive in it. So it is definitely scary. I would suggest even making contact with a case manager or the case manager supervisor at your local Department of Human Services and ask her if you can send, him or her, if you can send information about your individual's diagnosis. Just say you'd like to educate, you don't know if she's aware of what this particular diagnosis entails, talk to her when you're not in crisis. Because most of the times, if you reach out to them ahead of time, you're going to have a better outcome when the proverbial stuff hits the fan, right? So definitely reach out and try to do that. Suicide is a big issue. You want to know your community mental health resources. If your kiddo is living somewhere else or going to school somewhere else, you want to know their community mental health resources out there too. Because college is stressful for everybody, and it can have the potential to push you to a certain level where you may end up having mental health contact. And you want to be sure that you know how you're going to navigate that. The National Suicide Prevention Line is universal. It is 24 hours a day. Have that available to you. Because again, when, if little Timmy's failed 3 tests and he's lonely in the dorms and nobody's talking to him and he feels completely out of place and homesick and he says, gosh, I just can't do this anymore, you might want to have that number on hand. Okay? Now, a lot of people won't call that number. Why? Because it's scary. And we end up with these. These are not bad things, okay? A mental health hold, also known as M1, 5150, involuntary holds, they are scary to a lot of parents because they see their child losing autonomy. They see their child being very scared about what's going to happen. And usually there's a lot of regret about calling the suicide hotline, calling the RA on their floor, calling the police to check on your kiddo because you were worried, and this happens. So how do we make this not scary? It's all on you. If you escalate and act like this is scary, it's going to be incredibly traumatizing for your individual. And we want this to be an asset, not a penalty, not something that's punitive, because that's not what it's intended to be. So they can last up to 72 hours. And it's very important to know that. It can be 24, it can be 12, it can be a week. So up to 72 hours means that after 72 hours it will be reevaluated again. And then there's a possibility that that can be extended. So how do we turn this into something positive? We need to look at what was the initiating cause that caused your individual to have this mental health hold. Was it stress? Was it a lack of resources? Remember that triangle I showed you and I told you there really is a purpose to me showing it to you? Which one of those is not being met? And how can these individuals help you to help your individual? This may be your entry point into Department of Developmental Disabilities. This may be your entry point into SSI. Okay? So it does have the potential to not only calm the situation down for a little bit, but also provide resources. Things like this are very important to talk to your kiddo about, especially when they're getting up into their adult days. Because should any of these happen, you want to make sure that you've talked about them and you've really emphasized that they're not bad. It doesn't make him or her bad. The people that are trying to help him are not bad. Okay? Because these situations can turn very bad. I.e., if a police person shows up in order to initiate the mental health hold and your individual has had poor experience with law enforcement thus far and you've sheltered them to not have any more contact with law enforcement and they push a cop, what are we dealing with now? Okay? So again, you want to make sure that each and every one of these has been addressed in a way that is not scary. So this is what happens on mental health holds, medication stabilization. If you do not want your individual to be on medication, I would encourage you to consult with the medical staff, look up the medication, get to know what its side effects are, what it's intended for, what it does, how it interacts with testosterone, contact the Extraordinary Kids Clinic, talk to Rebecca Wilson, talk to Dr. Tartaglia, and find out what other issues can be going on with whatever medication they're on. If you decide that you do not feel that they should be on the medication or your individual doesn't want to be, they don't have to be. Okay? They do while they're in the hospital. They don't have to be after. Counseling referrals, case management, and again, building basic needs. And it's a little time period to have some therapy. Okay? Everybody needs some therapy from time to time. Residential living, I don't know if we need to cover this too much here, but I will cover it briefly because usually this is when all the stuff has gone very, very far and there's been very little resources in place and parents are like, I can't do it anymore. I can't. I need a residential placement. These things are very expensive. They're an alternative to home living. They can range from 30-day long stays to de-escalate the situation and go long-term if needed. They can address a variety of issues. They can be substance abuse-based, mental health-based, or maybe just a community living environment, okay? Few insurances cover it, so disability is going to be your funding source. That's why that's kind of important. These things are super duper costly. So definitely having at least contact with the Department of Developmental Disability, even if your individual doesn't qualify, is going to be very crucial should this need occur. It's voluntary. If you send your individual to a substance abuse program or a mental health program, they can leave if they're over 18, okay, unless it's court ordered or hospital based. So be aware of that. So if you send them somewhere in Utah, they can end up in Utah City. So be very aware about what goes on. Call the facility and find out what their policies are around it. And definitely ask questions. Go visit the place too. I can't stress that enough. Make sure that you have gone there and pop up. Just go randomly and don't call. Okay? And that's just to maintain your own peace of mind and also just make sure that the environment is constructive and maybe appropriate for your individual too. You may find that it's not an appropriate setting for your individual. And so be very aware of that. You do have the right to show up at any time you feel like it. Don't let them tell you you can't.
Therapeutic boarding schools or?
No. This would be there's like different houses that'll maybe have 12 bedrooms. They're an open door facility. They're in the middle of a neighborhood, and there's several individuals that live there. Yes. Yeah. Of course, and then you've got your substance abuse treatments that are going to be different from that. Substance abuse, we talked a little bit about this already, so I'm not going to go too much on this, but make sure you look into, does your individual even want to quit? If they're over 18 and they don't, you need to have a sit down and a heart-to-heart around that. Use that A or B conversation to really approach that, okay? Is safety an issue? If it is, that's when that mental health hold may become something that's helpful. Or adult protective services may become something that's helpful. Again, that's going back to that Department of Human Services and whether or not it's scary. I don't know. But if it comes down between your individual having several people at his house that are using drugs and alcohol, is calling APS the worst thing in the world? I don't think that it is. Okay? And also is detox an issue? With the current types of medications that we have now, we've got your narcotics, you've got your opiates, you've got your alcohol. Detoxing is very scary, so do you need to look at a facility that's going to allow them to detox? So you can't just hold them at home and expect that everything's going to go well. You need to make alternative plans. If this should erupt, call me, we'll find a detox facility. Guardianship, again, this is kind of one of those issues that's very scary. It does take away autonomy. I encourage parents to just know what it is. It's extremely difficult to get unless your individual is gravely disabled and unable to care for themselves. Now that may mean that in their home they have a bunch of people living there, friends that they've met out and about, and it's turned into a crash pad, in which case you can get guardianship. So you definitely want to see if the situation has erupted to the point where you're extremely concerned, is this something that you want to pursue? Or is it something that you want to allow someone else to do for you? Have a guardian ad litem that's appointed by the court or their godfather, if need be. Make sure you know that when you're asking somebody to be a guardian, that you let them know that these things do not fall under the responsibility of a guardian. Yes?
I wanted to share with you an experience that we had. Our daughter just turned 18, June 18th, and we were under the impression we should start the procedure 2 or 3 months before she turned 18. So we met with a lawyer who was supposedly an expert on guardianships, and paid all the fees and everything, got it all set up. And then like a week later, we're at another seminar through ARC, and there was a lawyer speaking. He said, whatever you do, don't get this guardianship before they're 18. He said, you already have guardianship. Otherwise, when they turn 18, you're going to have to pay it all again. So I get back over to the lawyer's office. Fortunately, she was not aware of it. So I said, stop everything, don't do anything. Well, a week later, still prior to June 18th, we get a notice from the court. Our court date's been set for early June. So I called and told them we're not going to be there. I called a lawyer and I said, we told you don't schedule this, for all the reasons we shared. oh, I didn't think it'd get scheduled that soon. I said, well, we're not coming, so cancel it. So then we get it rescheduled. And we would have had this other lawyer not told us, we would have to do all this again after she was 18. So you'll learn a lot along the way. Just because you're dealing with a supposed expert doesn't mean they know all the rules.
Yes. So you definitely want to seek different perspectives on this. This guardianship of Colorado.org, even if you don't live in Colorado, is going to answer a lot of questions for you. There's a lot of facts on there, to-dos, not to-dos, and have somebody to bounce some things off of.
There's one other comment. In Indiana, it varies by county. In our county, we had to get a lawyer for Katie and for us, which at first I thought was kind of odd, but the court doesn't know us, so they needed somebody looking out for Katie. And the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. But in other counties, the court, appoints a second lawyer, for the child, or whatever the situation.
I believe that's going to be the guardian ad litem that the court's going to appoint. And that's a powerful resource to have, and also get their information and keep in touch with them.
Well, and even our lawyer said, what do we need? And it was a pretty minimal response. Then when I met with Katie's lawyer, she goes, well, you're going to need a letter from your doctor stating medical reasons why you should have guardianship, which makes sense. The other lawyer hadn't mentioned that. And she said, well, I can tell you the judge is going to want that. I suggest you get it. And so we went ahead and got it. And guess what? They needed it.
Yeah.
So it's like, again, you really got to do your homework.
I don't know if this is true in every state, but there are levels of guardianship where we are. So I'm not a general guardian of our son. I'm a limited general guardian, and that allows me to go around different. Like I could when he was under 18, and it allowed him to keep some of his rights that he should have, like the vote and to drive. So looking at different levels.
Absolutely. Another form of guardianship is going to be your financial guardianship, and that may mean that you just have control over their checks if they get disability checks, to make sure that you pay their rent, that you give them a stipend or whatever, just to make sure that that check's not all blown on video games, pixie sticks, and beer. So that's definitely something to explore. Even if your individual may need very limited guardianship, definitely explore the financial guardianship, okay? They're still going to retain a ton of autonomy, and stuff's still going to get paid.
What about the flip side of all that in terms of liability issues?
That's where this comes into play. So under any of the guardianships, they're not required to provide for the individual out of his or her own funds. So that would mean that if for some reason the disability were to discontinue, they're not held accountable by the state to financially support that individual. If there's any, they're not required for the individual to come live with them. That cannot be forced. They're not accountable for the actions or behaviors. So this isn't like being a parent where if your kiddo does something very bad, you can be held accountable for it. It doesn't fall under the guardian's responsibility. These still falls under your individual. And last but not least, any harm that would be caused by the ward or by a caregiver or a selected guardian is not held under the liability of the guardianship. Does that make sense? So they actually don't have legal repercussions, financial repercussions, or basic need repercussions that could happen as a result of being a guardian. So if you were to ask somebody, like an older sibling or a younger sibling, to assume guardianship should something happen to you, that's always a good idea. Because definitely you want to have a couple contingencies. Unless you have the magic of the fountain of youth and are planning to live forever, who is going to take over after you? Okay? If you've been paying bills and you've been the financial guardian for the last 20 years, who's going to do that should something happen to you? Okay, is your eldest willing to do that? Is his cousin? Whatever. How is that going to go? His godfather, rabbi, little Timmy that came to the bar mitzvah, who's willing to do that, okay? And ask. You might be surprised. A very close friend of your individual may be willing to assume that. Because you definitely have to look at how awesome your person is. So don't panic and think that this is such a bad thing. Your individual is pretty cool. So definitely look at the resources they have, the social networks that they've developed that will really facilitate a positive guardianship for them. And again, you want to really stress to them that this is not punitive, okay? You're not taking away this ability because of it or because of something that they did or didn't do. So get their feedback. If you're going to assume their financial guardianship, maybe ask them, how much do you think you might need to have for your fun money to go buy a video game? If we do this budget and I show you what's left over, what do you think would be reasonable? Get their input, okay? And that's definitely going to help for this process to feel a lot less stigmatizing. Okay, law enforcement. I really, really want to touch on this, especially with your kiddos' age. You want your law enforcement to be positive. I don't know about you, I'm not particularly happy when I get pulled over for a ticket, but I've also had positive interactions with law enforcement. So unless you've had those continuously, you want to make sure that this is something that's available. You want to have non-crisis contact with your police department, okay? Because when little Janie is throwing stuff and screaming at the top of her lungs is not when you want to make friends with an officer, okay? It's not the best time. Now, if little Janie has volunteered at the police station and is really good friends with Officer McGruff, and you know that, that is a resource that can come into play should the police be called. Neighbors hear yelling, they call the police. You're going to have a lot more to stand on if you say, you know what, little Katie's volunteered over there, she knows Officer McGruff really well. She may not want to talk to Officer Smith, but if he's on duty, she may de-escalate with him because guess what, that's her friend. Okay? So you definitely want to have that be an experience for them. Have them do a ride-along. There's an application you can fill out online. Police need to not be scary, okay? Because also, one of the individuals that I've spoken to before, she's had her kiddo role play with her because he had an iPod stolen on the light rail. And he got off the train in a huff, big guy charging at you going, somebody stole my iPod. Oh my goodness, that cop is freaked out. You've got somebody charging. None of us like to see that, right? Now, if she role played with him, she was able to get him to kind of calm down. He called her and he said, Mom, this happened. And he went with his phone to the cop and said, my mom's got to talk to you. And the cop took the phone, talked to his mom, and she explained, somebody stole his iPod, he's really upset. And the situation de-escalated. So, crisis averted, right? You definitely want to look at what is the worst thing that can happen and how do you keep it from happening. This is one of them. Request a person to volunteer, meet some officers, do ride-alongs, learn hours, names, and contacts of different officers. If you have the ability, have officers on different shifts that you're friends with, okay? A day shifter, night shifter, evening shifter, the dispatch lady. You can't go wrong with making contact with your police department. Give them information, by the way, on what your individual's diagnosis is. Because again, we have a lot of poor data that says what this diagnosis is not, okay? And if that cop read the study in 1998, some of you guys know what I'm talking about, right? So if that study is the only information that this law enforcement officer has about the chromosome variant population, he's going to have a very negative perception about how to cope with Timmy, right? So you want to make sure that you can dispel all those myths that are around in the community. And then finally, have them associate law enforcement as something fun, people of trust, people that can help, and talk to them about boundaries with law enforcement too. Just an FYI. So law enforcement typically don't like to be hugged. Don't approach them on their gun side. Basic things like that are going to be really helpful, okay? Plan for prevention. Make sure that law enforcement knows how your individual communicates or can communicate. Not when they're doing it, but on a good day. Let them know they can behave differently, think differently, trust differently, respond differently. This is where bringing your data to a police station is going to be really important, okay? Again, nobody has time to read a lot. Do a little bullet sheet, okay, and take it to your law enforcement agency. Call the sergeant and ask him if you can talk to him a little bit about chromosome variants, okay, and go do a little presentation. Bring Krispy Kreme. But make sure that this is a positive theme. Make sure they know you. That's just as important. Make sure they know what your individual looks like too, because if he runs away and he's sitting at the park really angry, it might help if somebody that at law enforcement sees him and goes, hey, does your mom know where you're at? Right? Versus just kind of driving by. This can be a very positive, huge resource. Police are everywhere, so we want to make sure that we use this resource. Again, there's advocacy, protection, and definitely any police contact is going to help you with government service agencies. So definitely keep this in mind. Think about the worst case scenarios that can happen, okay? Dating younger individuals, drugs, alcohol, theft, vandalism, threats. What are the worst things that can happen? You want to plan for that and have that in the back of your head. And you want to know how to de-escalate those. Again, we talked about role-playing and minimizing the misconception that police contact is something bad or all is negative. We also all know that our individuals do not do well with being restrained, correct? So you need to also present that in your data to law enforcement, because maybe sitting them down in a police car isn't that bad, but having somebody try to jump on them and cuff them and take them down will be catastrophic, okay? And when somebody's angry and they're not de-escalating, unfortunately that is what's going to happen, okay? There's still tasers, there's still mace. How do we make this a non-negative, non-traumatic experience? I cannot stress that enough, okay? Incarceration, unfortunately for your individuals that take testosterone, I have not heard of any penal system that is willing to administer testosterone while the individual is there. I've heard about very negative things that have happened when the individual went off their testosterone while incarcerated. And I've also heard about individuals being put on some very heavy medications while incarcerated. You want to be very aware of this. Again, this is where reaching out to the jail matters. Find your city jail, talk to the sergeant, okay? Tell them a little bit about Klinefelters. Talk to the medical staff if you can. So you want to speak frequently with all persons involved in your case. Should incarceration arise, you're going to need your data for lawyers, for judges, for guardians, for everybody, for case managers at the jail, for the mental health professionals at the jail, for the deputies at the jail, okay? You want to use your network of resources. Again, it's going to be very difficult for you to contact everybody that you've met at this conference when little Jimmy's incarcerated and has court in 2 days. So you might want to plan for that now. Okay? Plan for the worst, hope for the best, and you'll be okay. Document, retain legal counsel always. If your individual is over 18, you want to have already had this conversation with them. What happens if you go to jail? Okay? What do you say? What don't you say? How do you act? Make sure they retain legal counsel. Make sure they know that. Make sure they know that they don't have to say anything. A lot of the times I've been contacted by parents whose kids turned down legal counsel and they're looking at some heavy charges. And the parents call in the jail saying, I want my kid to have a lawyer. And the judge goes, hey, he's over 18. He doesn't have to have one. So he's going to take a plea bargain for a sex offense and be on the National Sex Offender Registry because he can get out of jail in a week versus 6 months. You want to make sure that there is a lot in place for this because this turns really ugly really quickly. Okay? Even though your child may have any behavioral issues at all, still plan for this, okay? Community resources, definitely link with a lot of people in your community. That includes fire rescue, youth hubs, if your individual is 16, 17, and they like to stay out at night, late, or they have a propensity to maybe get in trouble. Youth hubs are where they go if there's any police contact. Again, this is kind of like the jail. You want your youth hub to know about your diagnosis. You want them to know about your kiddo. You want them to have to have had contact with your individual prior to them coming there, and just maybe have them go in and volunteer. I'm not saying go in and say, hey, Timmy may end up here one day, no. But you definitely want to make sure that this is one of those CYAs, right? Plan for the worst. If they're ever at the youth hub, how are they going to handle that, okay? And again, volunteer opportunities, networking, you can just pop up. You can volunteer there if you like, okay? So definitely keep that in account. Okay, this is for all you guys up here, the 18 and over uh-ohs, when this has not happened at all. Okay, you want to plan for this as soon as possible. If your child's over 18, all is not lost. It just means that you got to crack down and do it a little faster. You want to look at guardianship. You want to look at your own will. You want to look at setting up a trust if you need be. And you want to talk to legal counsel about how that is going to affect benefits. Okay, that's very important. You want to focus on financial security and well-being unless you have a significant amount of disposable income that can support your child for the duration of their life. What are they going to do when you're gone? Okay. Money management, we talked about guardian ad litem. Independent and safe living. Okay, so how can they get some sort of housing facilitated for them that is safe and that is monitored in some way? And of course, decision-making capacity related to needs and legal issues. Definitely jump on all these. Again, what are you going to do in a year? What are you going to do by next month? Make yourself a checklist. What do you need to have done by 5 years? What do you need to have done by 10 years? What do you need to have done in 20? Plan for all that and take those steps and write it down because it's very difficult to remember. Whew, this was a lot of information. How are you guys feeling? Awesome, you're ready. Woo! So develop written contingency plans. That's what crisis management is about. We talked a little bit about how do government services mean crisis management, because you need to have a variety of paths on how to approach these things. If A doesn't work, can we do B? Can we do C? If we do C, then B, will that work? I don't know. Give it a shot. Okay, write these down and problem solve. You're going to have to finagle things. Start where your individual is at. If they're 18, that's where you got to start. You can't start with the what if I had done this when they were 4. Kind of past. Make sure that the environment is always driven by your intervention, always drives your intervention. So what is going on currently, where they're currently staying at, and what is the most necessary intervention first and foremost. If that's college, great. If that's medical needs, great. Where are they at? Start there. Begin building your network, your resource list with contact phone numbers, contact emails. Follow up on those about every year. I'd shoot an email and make sure the person still works there. Make sure their contact information is still correct. Okay, because those things change. There's a high turnover in a lot of these agencies. So if that person's gone, make another connection. And that's, I mean, it's almost like a job. You got to keep up on those things, okay? Because again, if you have a big need in 5 years and your most promising resource no longer works there, it's going to be tough to make another contact in a day because you have a crisis at hand, okay? Thank you for coming. Good luck with your planning. Please email me if you need to. I hope I didn't scare you, but good luck.